Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Vanessa Wills. She is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the George Washington University, and today we're talking about her book, Marx's Ethical Vision. So, Dr. Wills, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to speak with you today.
So tell me, start by telling us a little bit about what's behind this book. I mean, what got you interested in exploring what Marxist theory would entail about the nature of morality?
So I was already a philosophy student when I became familiar with Marx's ideas and started to get to know socialists, which happened through activism that I was doing in the early 2000s. I joined the anti-war movement, protesting against the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the war on terror, the so-called war on terror in general. And in doing that, I've got to know more people who were on the left, who came out of a tradition of working class activism and ideas. And I especially noticed that after the 2004 presidential election in the United States, many of the liberals I knew were extremely disoriented and demobilized. And the people who were ready to hit the streets again, right, and just kind of, or continue to, and to keep going and to try to analyze the moment and think about how to intervene in it, they were socialists. And that's what I wanted to be doing. So that is who I was attracted to and drawn to. And that's how I got to learn more about Marx's ideas. And I found that I also had these kind of personal questions about just my involvement in activism, what it is that I was doing. And so the same kind of philosophical spirit, I guess, that is the reason I was already a philosophy PhD in the first place, I brought to that work that I was doing. And I wanted to investigate these questions about the sort of the meaning of this activism and how it fit into a larger context of how to promote the well-being of humans in general, how to do good in the world. And so that question began to really obsess me.
But one very interesting thing, and you also mentioned this in your book, is that in the critique of German ideology, Marx and Engels say that, quote, the communists do not preach morality at all. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's the one of the most important questions. And I mean, I take it exactly on its face. I think I also think it's a mistake to preach morality to working people, because I think that the work that moral philosophers can do is rather to interpret theoretically, abstractly, and philosophically um, uh, aims and practices that are already existing in working class struggle. And so I take it that what I'm up to in that book and in a lot of my work is to think through to its logical conclusions the already existing activity of working people attempting to survive and attempting to push back against that which frustrates their ability to satisfy basic needs, and much less to actually flourish as individual human beings.
Mhm. So another thing that I would like to ask you is morality a form of ideology, and what does ideology mean in Marxism?
Yeah. So for the first question, I say yes, but of course that hangs on the answer to the second question, right? Of what does it mean to talk about ideology? So one very common way of thinking about ideology is that it is always illusory, always such as to conceal reality, maybe even that it is inherently reactionary and has an inherent ruling class content, such that ideology should, if on this way of thinking about it, be understood as a conceptual form through which a ruling class of society imposes its views of the world onto those of those who are ruled, right? You know, the working classes, those who are excluded from work, and so on. And there's, in my view, there's a partial truth to this. Ideology does sometimes function in exactly that way. But I think that it's important to think about ideology the way I argue about it in the book, as I say that ideology is better understood as a system of ideas that give a perspective on the world from the point of view of a class. And so, of course, we can have bourgeois ideology, but I argue that there's also proletarian ideology as well, and that Marxism should be thought of, right, as part of a proletarian ideology. That even more thoroughgoing than that, right? Anything that encourages us to think about the world as something that is historical, that is dynamic, that is constantly changing and in a process of unending transformation, into which we are already intervening, and to which we can intervene more rationally and more consciously and more collectively and socially than we have so far, so as to bring about the conditions for human well-being and flourishing, right? And for the expansion of our powers and ways of interacting with one another in pro-social ways. The piece that remains, the sort of critical, or I should say the pejorative maybe piece that remains even on my understanding of ideology, is that ideology is very much a form of thought that we find in class society. And so I do think that when we think about the possibility of moving beyond class society, that part of what we are talking about then is the abolition of ideological ways of thinking as well, right? Ways of thinking that are themselves structured by a conflict among economic classes. But we're not there yet. And so we still have to deal with ideology. We still have to speak and theorize in the ways that are available to us, and the best way available to us is through a working class perspective on the world. I mean, which is what the materialist conception of history is. It's what Marxism is.
So, about that materialist perspective on history, what does it reveal about the nature of human beings?
Yeah. So, in the same portion of the critique of the German ideology where Marx and Engels introduced this term, so I'm sure many of your viewers will know, but just to highlight, so the critique of the German ideology is the place sort of, just shy of midway through Marx's theoretical corpus, that is often identified as the line of demarcation between the poetic, humanistic, romantic, early Marx and the hard-nosed, scientific, by the numbers, materialist, determinist, later Marx, right? And it's the first place that Marx and Engels, his collaborator Friedrich Engels, present what could be called a kind of mature, sort of well-developed explanation of their methodology, of how it is that they are approaching the questions they take up. And they say in the same place where they talk about what they call the materialist conception of history, they say that that their method is to look not at man, right, capital M, as an abstraction, but rather men in actual concrete historical individual human beings, to examine how it is that human beings have intervened into their natural and social circumstances so as to satisfy their needs, and how that process of labor and need satisfaction then transforms human beings and explains everything actually about why it is that history has unfolded in the way that it has, and that therefore also provides some guidance about how human beings might go on to intervene in a conscious way, which is to say, aware of themselves as having as being engaged in this activity of producing themselves through their interventions into the world out of which human beings emerge. And so one way that I think about this for myself, when philosophy is hard, and whenever I feel stuck and I'm trying to make sense of some problem or think through what it is to have a Marxist approach to a question, I come back to a little slogan for myself, which is human existence is a human product, which can sound very simple and almost pat, but has profound implications. So I think one great example is in the case of race. There's a lot of work on race that treats races as though they are basically ahistorical and natural and sort of given to us. That treats racism and racist antipathy as though it is a ineluctable and ineradicable feature of essential human nature that can't be done away with. But if we remember that human existence is a human product, and therefore with the question of race too, we have to ask how it is that human beings have produced this concept and produced these ways of relating to one another and produced these attitudes that then leads us away from sort of fatalism about it, or the idea that it can't be done away with, and leads us toward looking at what point in history, and as a result of what historical forces, did this emerge and come about, and what could potentially be leveraged and intervened into to do away with racism. So that's just to give one example of what it looks like to take a materialist conception of history and see what human beings are as having a history, and the content of that history being human agency, human activity.
Mhm. But I mean, on the topic of human nature, what kind of normativity derives then from this view of human nature, if any? And what is the rich individual for Marx?
Yes. So it's a great question, because on the one hand, what I've said is quite thin. So I think that for Marx, human nature is labor. It is that activity of conscious and goal-directed intervention into our environments to satisfy our needs. But precisely because I think everything about human beings can be thought of in these terms and explained in these terms. It also means that it's not as though you can sort of neatly say, well, these are the things that are instances of labor and those things aren't. So those things are somehow inhuman or income or sort of not properly thought of as part of human nature. It all is. But the normativity derives from the fact that some of the things that we do are such as to promote our existence as beings that engage in this process of human self-changing, of human self-creation. And some things are such as to stultify it and limit it and prevent it or bring it to an end altogether. And I take it that this is one of the most important arguments for communism and against capitalism, that capitalism in a very fundamental and basic sense is going to kill us. Whether it's climate change, illness, war, you name it. And that's even before we get to the sort of everyday of going to, I'm fortunate, I'm a philosopher, I can go to work and dream or whatever, but also just the sort of everyday mundane reality of the millions of human beings that have lived lives where they're going to work and doing the same boring, stultifying, degrading work hour after hour, day after day, year after year, until their lives end, and which is also a kind of death for a human being. And to contrast that with Marx's idea of rich individuality, or of the rich human being, he's speaking there of a person who is engaged in this the sort of all-sided, in principle, limitless proliferation of the ways that they can engage with other people, with the world around them. We have this, for example, it's also in the ideology. Marx talks about even the sort of being constricted to one profession, he thinks, is at odds with the notion of rich individuality, because people need time and energy and resources to be a fisher in the morning, and I forget exactly how it goes, but it's like a fisher in the morning, a baker in the afternoon, a critical critic at night, right, and so on. So that sense of I've been using the word flourishing a lot, but what I want to say is also the sense of of color, of variety, of mixing it up, of changing, right, of being different things and doing different things, and of having possibilities open to you, and having the world open to you, and being able to embrace life with a spirit of creativity and experimentation, and having the material resources available that support that and make that possible. All of that, I think, is bound up with Marx's argument for why it is that it's communism. It is a society organized around production for the purpose of human beings and their flourishing, rather than for profit, that is actually compatible with bringing about the full realization of human essence and human nature, which just is the sort of conscious creativity itself.
Mhm. Since we are now about to get into some bourgeois conceptions of ethical values, critiques of them, and how they are approached through a Marxist perspective, first of all, what is bourgeois ethics?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things I say in the book is that when I use the word bourgeois, so by bourgeois, first of all, most simply, we mean capitalist, right? We mean having to do or associated with that class in a capitalist society which owns the means of production, factories, raw materials, and so on, which owns the means of production and is able to sustain itself and satisfy its needs in virtue of the fact that it owns the means of production for that society, and therefore does not have to sell its labor for a wage, unlike the working class, which does, which satisfies its needs by selling its ability to work as a commodity to capitalists.
Right.
So when I say bourgeois, right, one thing I just mean is that thing, right, having to do with that capitalist class. But it's important to note, and I say this in the book, that I do not use bourgeois as merely some sort of shady epithet, right, or name calling. Sometimes people, oh, that's so bourgeois. Okay, that's not what I'm doing in the book, right? I'm using it as a kind of scientific category. And bourgeois ethics, I mean, I am convinced by Marx's argument, and he's following a point made by Hegel earlier, that the sort of sine qua non of bourgeois ethics is utilitarianism, right? Is this emphasis on calculability, on utility, right? On the sort of identifying the value of a thing in virtue of its suitability as a means to some further end, and in utilitarianism, as in capitalism, the end is just sort of like the endless accumulation of a good, whether it's utility on the one hand or capital on the other. With some of the other forms of ethical systems that Marx himself criticizes and that I discuss in the book, the connection is less plainly obvious. But I think in the case of Kantianism, for example, which is an ethical view that's often thought together with Marxism, and there's this longstanding debate and question about whether perhaps Marxism can be made compatible with Kantian ethics and vice versa. I think you still have there the fact that there's a strong emphasis on this notion of an undetermined free will, this kind of philosophically idealist conception of the human being as being most importantly identified with this pure act of willing, and that's the sort of thing that Marx is going to think is totally incompatible with a viewpoint that is materialist in the way that he is, namely thinking there's nothing about human beings that can be detached somehow from thinking about them in their specific context and in virtue of their needs and interests. And the last thing I'll say, because this is a long answer, but the last thing I'll say about this is that Marx embraces the idea of encouraging people to act according to their interests. This is the essence of, maybe essence is too strong, but this is like a very significant part of what's going on in Marx's writings, that it's precisely why the working class is the class that he identifies as an agent of historical change. It's because he thinks that the interests that working class people have in surviving and in not being abused is in alignment with the interests of humanity in continuing to exist and perhaps more than exist, maybe have a good time while we're existing, continue to make art, continue to to have social interactions that are positive and fulfilling, and so that too is going to be quite a difference from something like Kantianism, which is very skeptical of the notion of acting in accordance with your interests, and advocates this kind of sacrifice of self-interest. So the question of like what bourgeois ethics is going to depend on what ethical system we're talking about, but that's just by way of pointing out some of the things that Marx sees as distinguishing his view from some of these others.
So now I want to ask you about some specific ethical values that you explore in the book and their bourgeois version, and then how we can approach them through a Marxist perspective. So starting with individuality, what is individuality and why does it matter?
That's a great question. What is individual? I mean, so in the book, I think about I sort of talk about a conception of individuality that Marx has in mind, and then a question, and then a sort of, and then that's contrasted with what he sees as a capitalist or bourgeois kind of individuality that is that is that is grounded in a kind of rigid opposition between the individual and the social. So this comes up in places like, for example, the Communist Manifesto, where Marx imagines a kind of bourgeois critic saying, you want to do away with individuality, and then the answer is, we want to do away with your kind of individuality, namely this atomized separateness of hostile and competitive individuals who for whom sociality is a kind of necessary evil, and to be mitigated and guarded against jealously, in every possible way. And that's the vision of individuality that Marx sees as existing in liberalism and sort of social contract theory and so on. And he opposes to it a conception of individuality that represents a kind of abolition or overcoming of the seeming opposition between the social and the individual. Marx sometimes writes of the social individual, the person who is only made possible through their interactions with society, and only as a result of various kinds of historical transformations over time. And to put that a different way, we express our even under capitalism, we express our individuality in all sorts of ways. I love going to the opera. I love cooking. I love camping. There's all these things, that are ways that I like to spend my time if I can. But all of those concepts are totally historical concepts, right? They emerge out of a whole history of ways that human beings have developed to interact with the world around them and to conceptualize what it is that they're doing. And so the thought is that it's precisely because of the whole complexity of human behavior and ways of organizing and thinking about that behavior that I have available to me all sorts of ways that I might express myself in the world, which is like part and parcel of what makes me not exactly like the person next to me, right? For all of us. And so for individuality to be something more than just the bare fact that we are countable, that us in this conversation, there's one and then another one, like for it to mean something more than that, requires this whole socio-historical story that's gone before. And so Marx argues that individuality is a result of sociality, and is instead of looking at it the other way around and sort of thinking that society is something that individuals then, on the basis of their rational self-interest, decide to tolerate. What if we look at the fact that sociality is the kind of original fact of human existence, which gives rise to the different ways that individuals might develop themselves and emerge. So it's hard for me to, because that is the way that I'm thinking about individuality, and the way that I'm reading Marx on individuality. It's hard for me to actually give a kind of account of like what individuality is in general, right? What it is that individuality is, like a concept of individuality that is abstract in a way that captures both of these different ways of thinking about it. And especially because I tend to think that the more abstract you get, the closer you get to the sort of, well, there's one and then there's another one, two individual people. Well, who cares, But the other, it's the fact of what it means to have a diverse array of different human beings who interact with the world in their own distinctive ways that makes individuality matter, I think.
Mm-hmm. And how about rights? I mean, what are bourgeois equal rights, and would there be rights in communism or not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So so Marx, there's a number of places where Marx addresses the question of rights, and one of the places that I look at most, or that figures, I think, most significantly into my argument in that portion of the book, is the critique of the Gotha program, where he's critical of attempts to describe capitalism as unjust or as a kind of rights violation. And he argues that it is just, it is fair, and the reason, and it's fair according to the internal standards of capitalism. But there's also, for Marx, a kind of, I think, a kind of historical assessment of the nature of a right, where he's seeing that rights themselves presuppose a context in which you're called upon to defend your rights, and you're called upon to make a claim against others that is based in rights. And so he sees it as intrinsically, I mean, sort of the same story I gave about individuality actually, has important, links, and kind of dovetails with the story about rights, because the idea of rights, at least as the individual rights of capitalist society and liberal democracy, presupposes the kind of generalized antagonism among individuals that we see actually in capitalist society. So I think the way to think about rights is that in a fully developed communist society, if we ever see one of those, that the salience of a right is not, it sort of disappears, sort of goes away, right? Because if we are imagining a society that's organized precisely to satisfy people's needs and to make available the things that they want and require, and I want to be clear, what needs here is meant extremely broadly, right? The need for a person to have access to paint and paintbrushes is going to count, right? the and so if we have a society that's organized in that way, and we have a society that is organized in such a way that the flourishing of each is the condition of the flourishing of all, right? Such that for me to insist upon what I need is also for me directly to insist on something that you need as well. It seems to me we could talk about rights in that context, but I'm not sure what it would add, concretely speaking. Um, and so I argue that rights that will be abolished along with lots of other lots of other stuff, right? And but it's important to be. I think it's important to be very careful about this, and I engage in the rights chapter. I engage with the work of another Marx scholar, Igor Shojkabrod, because I think that he very nicely insists that Marxists should not be glib about rights in the present world, where, as we know, they are constantly being run over roughshod, and they do provide a language that people can use to defend themselves. And I completely agree with him about this and think it is a very real danger, and one that I would also be keen to avoid. But I disagree about the sort of the abstract question about whether it would make sense to say that there's rights of this kind in a communist future.
And I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that potential or possible communist future in a second. But just before that, Marx famously seems to call for the abolition of morality altogether. So, what would abolition be like in this context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it goes back to, I think, the first or second question you asked about ideology, because morality is a form of ideology, and ideology is a sort of classed perspective on a class conflict. And so if what we're imagining is the abolition of class society, and certainly of class conflict, obviously, then the question arises, like, where does morality go? And there's a there's a couple ways to think about this. I'm going to present two of them, right? So one is that I think it's useful to think about morality as a way of theorizing a gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And I use that formulation on a few occasions throughout the book, but keen observers with lots of time on their hands will notice that there's a footnote at one point in the book. I think it is in the Abolition of Morality chapter, where I say, well, of course, this is a bit of a heuristic way of speaking, because actually the whole point for Marx is not that there's a huge gap, but rather that the world that should be is already existing within the current one, right? Precisely in the persons of the working class, right? But okay, that aside, right? Thinking about morality as, how is it that things ought to be, but so far aren't. And so if we think about morality in that way, then morality goes the same place where rights go, right? What is the theory to analyze the world, the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be, when the world is actually made as it should be? So the sort of content for moral theorizing to be about is abolished, right? And so therefore the sort of theoretical practice as well. So that's one way to talk about it. But I think, the second way that I'll mention, and the one that I spell this out too, in that chapter, is that Marx uses this throughout his writings, he comes back to the idea that our human senses are themselves historical products. So again, coming back to human existence as a human product. So our sense of hearing, right? The difference between hearing just like a god awful clang and hearing experimental music is mostly exposure, and maybe a little theory, maybe somebody explains something to you, but it's not biological, it's not physiological. You have the same ear. And Marx uses a number of examples like this throughout his writing, and he also uses it to talk about the eye, and ways of seeing, right, and how that changes, right, our ability to see and to interpret the world, not through any physiological change, through a educational and cultural one. And I think something like this is what he has in mind for human beings. He actually talks about sight. He talks about transformations in sight and hearing and smell, and then he talks about a human sense. And so I unpack what is the human sense. And the human sense for Marx is, for one thing, it's precisely the thing that he thinks is conspicuously missing in utilitarianism. Not to beat up on the utilitarian, right? But it's the thing he thinks is conspicuously missing there, because and that also is, broadly speaking, conspicuously missing in the apperceptive capacities of a species whose life is dominated by commodity exchange, is dominated by the making the making totally universally interchangeable of all things, so that we see things and we think, how much can I get for that? Right? There's this sort of like instant translation into abstract quantitative accumulation of value, of just abstract value. And this is something that Marx thinks absolutely has to be healed and overcome. That part of the transformation that human beings must affect in themselves in order for communism to be possible is to apprehend the world around them and see it, see it for what it is, see it in itself. I mean, this is something this is something that comes up throughout Capital, but even very early on in things like the Power of Money, one of the 1844 manuscripts, where Marx is writing about how money sort of confounds all differences and turns everything into its opposite. And you can you can, and he says the what it would be for this to no longer be the case would mean, for example, that if you want to be loved, you couldn't just shell out cash for it. You have to be lovable, and if you're not lovable, I don't know what to, like. But there's this sort of this distinction in Marx between the ways that universal commodity exchange is also the universal emptying out of difference, and of specificity and uniqueness. And I think part of what's going on for Marx is that he thinks if we can fix that, if you can actually see a human being not in an alienated way where you see a human being and all you see is a means to an end. And here you can hear why people think maybe Kantian ethics will work with this, because there is some affinity. But if you can look at a human being and rather than seeing a means to your private end, you see instead like a being with needs who is your sibling, right? Who is you, and who has conditions of well-being and of flourishing that are also yours and that you have a direct interest in promoting. I think that's what Marx sees as replacing our kind of ham-fisted attempts now. Like, it's good that we do them, but we're reduced to these ham-fisted attempts to ask ourselves, well, if I were a good person, what would I do then? Like, if I did really understand that other human beings exist and have their own, their own, like, conditions of well-being, and there are things that they're doing that matter to them, how would I behave then? And so I think Marx is asking is for ethics, as is so often the case with Marx, the distinction is in painting a trail, a kind of a path forward, where that world that we represent in thought as desirable is not just a kind of mere ethical ideal, but is something that we could actually bring about.
Mhm. So, keeping in mind then that, according to Marx at least, ethics would be abolished in a fully developed communist society, and it would be sort of just a transitory historical phenomenon, what would it be like to exist and socially interact in such a society?
Oh, yeah. Great question. I don't think I know. I mean, some of what I've already said suggests some things about what it would be like, but I think what I'm noticing within myself as I attempt to answer your question is that I'm hesitant to, um, I'm hesitant to, sort of, make recipes for the cookshops of the future, to coin a phrase, you know what I mean? Like, um, I think I think some of the places that we can look for hints is in what we already experience as some of the more pro-social forms of interaction that we somehow miraculously manage to pull off even in today. you know and so like I'll give you an example. Like, I've um I don't have this anymore so much, but back in the day when I was starting to teach undergrads, I would, the students all would, when if Marx would come up, the students would always say, "Well, but people are just selfish, and nobody does anything unless there's something in it for them," and so on. And so I remember one exchange where a student expressed something of that nature, and then I asked her if she did any volunteering. And she said, yeah. She's like, what does that have to do with anything? But she says, yeah, I do. And I'm like, well, tell me about it. I'm curious. And she says, well, a couple days after, her face lights up, right? And she says, well, a couple days after school, I go to this elementary school that's just a couple blocks away from campus. And I read to the kids, and I help them to improve their literacy skills. And I'm like, well, what do you enjoy about doing that? And she's like, oh, it's just great to be with them, and I'm helping, and I can see them grow. And, it's just something that's really wonderful to do. And I'm like, do you get paid for it? And she says, no, it's completely volunteer. And I'm like, it turns out that people, like, even in a world where every minute that you spend helping another person for free is in fact taking food out of your own mouth, because those are the perverse incentives under which we exist. People crave to help. They crave to be together. I think this is even, there's lots of terrible lessons to take from COVID-19 and the pandemic and lockdown and the sort of reactionary and irrational ways that people have responded to it. But in my most generous moods, when I think about the sum of the hostility that people had to social distancing and to staying at home, whatever, when I'm feeling my most generous, I think, well, people want to be together. They really want to be together. They want to be with one another. Okay, like they should wear a mask while doing it, but I just think there's things that we see, even under the conditions in which we live now, that just make it clear that there's really good reason to think that if we could remove some of the barriers to that what we would find is a lot of loving, pro-social, collaborative, creative activity, right? And ways of being among one another. I can't guarantee that to anyone, and also the people of this kind of future society, like would it by the very nature of the case would be a people formed by a whole history that hasn't happened yet, right? So it's difficult to say exactly what life would look like for them, but I think there's things about what life looks like for us that give a lot of good reason for hope. People already engage in all kinds of activity where the aim is to be good to their fellow human beings.
I have two more questions then. The first one, going back for a second to the topic of bourgeois ethics or the ethics or ethical values of the capitalist class. Does neoliberal capitalism, or has it even delivered on its promise of freedom, which is something we haven't really touched on, human rights and the other values associated with it?
So you won't be surprised to hear that I think the answer is a resounding no. And I mean, yeah, I'm sort of tempted. I'm just like, no, no, it hasn't, and I think, the proof is in the pudding. We're at a point today where people can look back and see that what has occurred over the last, let's say 50 years of neoliberal reaction and attacks on any influence that working class movements have had in society, in actually expanding freedom, and whether it's the student movement of the 1960s globally, whether it's decolonial movements globally, whether in the U.S. I'm here in the U.S., so in the U.S. case, things like the civil rights movement, the queer rights movement, women's movement, and so on. All of the ways that neoliberalism has been a roughly half century long onslaught against all of that. We can see now that the result is just reaction and loss of freedom. I mean, even if we think of freedom in a very rudimentary way, in terms of just the resources that people have to be able to do what they want, people make less money, just in the most basic sense, not to mention the assaults on intellectual freedom that we have all over the world, and of course quite famously in the US, these with the attacks on universities that are going on here, but of course you see it also it's been underway for a long time in places like Hungary, for example, sort of way further down that road that we seem to be headed down now here. But it has, however, it must be said, also promoted a lot of freedom for capitalists, right? And that kind of goes to, again, Marx's critique of bourgeois rights and bourgeois individuality, and in this case, bourgeois freedom, because the freedom of capital to move around the planet. Neoliberalism has done a great job of advancing that. The freedom of capitalists to do what they want without any fetter placed on them whatsoever by law or by the demands of the masses of society. Neoliberalism has done a great job of establishing that. So, but that's why we need a critique of the concept of freedom, right? And who's and what kinds of freedom are being promoted and which are highly damaged.
Mm-hmm. So my last question then, and going back to the idea of human existence itself as a human product, should intellectuals, I mean academics and other kinds of intellectuals, also contribute in some way to this human product?
Well, I think we are, right? I mean, so part of the implication of that is that we always already are, and then the question is, do we have a kind of obligation of some kind to contribute positively rather than not? And I say yes, a resounding yes, yes, yes. It's I can't imagine. It's hard for me to imagine doing anything else with the fact that, I've had the opportunity to learn quite a lot. I have the opportunity to study. I have the opportunity to write and to let my views be known. And it's hard for me to think of another worthwhile purpose other than to put all of that to the service of humanity, of human beings. And so I think absolutely that and it doesn't. And I'm not saying it always has to be a narrow. It doesn't have to be narrowly construed. I'm not saying every academic needs to drop everything and work self-consciously for revolution or something. Although that would be great. But I think there's all kinds of work that people do that that helps to demonstrate the incredible potential of human beings. I think we see it, for example, in the attacks on science in the US, which I think is highly tied to the attacks on trans people as well. But and both of these are also global phenomena. But like when trans people use the knowledge and the tools developed by science to improve their lives, to go from feeling unable to show up in the world in a way that matches their identity and that is affirming of who they are as individual people. One of the things that they're demonstrating is that there can be better living through science, right? That having knowledge of the world and having the ability to manipulate it, can put us in charge of what we are and how we show up. And that is a dangerous proposition when you are promoting a reactionary right-wing perspective that absolutely requires lowering expectations and convincing people that, Margaret Thatcher style, there is no alternative. The world you live in and the way you exist in it that's it. This is it, and there's no changing it. And so, I think there's lots of science that people do that, of course, is not in any way directly tied to a political project, but that is about how can human beings intervene into the world in such a way as to make our lives better. And I think, I think all of that is important and necessary. And yes, I do think there's an obligation to think through in some way, how it is that your work helps to promote human well-being.
By the way, since you mentioned trans people, I can't
Mhm.
resist asking you this question, which will be then the last one. Do you think that Marx himself would be open to, and that Marxism easily accommodates for an intersectional perspective on things, like going beyond class and also including other social categories like race and gender?
Yeah, so in my I'll answer those questions separately because I think Marx himself is there's this kind of often held view of Marx that he didn't think about race or he didn't think
Okay.
about gender. But Marx actually wrote, not infrequently about both of these issues. He would write articles for U.S. newspapers. I remember Marx was living at the time of the U.S. Civil War. And so he wrote like an open letter to Abraham Lincoln. He wrote an open letter to white workers in the United States telling them that labor in the white skin cannot be free so long as in the black it's branded. He and Engels, thought a lot about the case of workers in Ireland who were often made subject to a kind of racialized oppression, right, and exclusion. There's a decent amount of good work on this. One book in particular is like Kevin B. Anderson's Marx at the Margins, which actually is just about these kinds of questions. Marx and Engels, including even in the Communist Manifesto itself, but also elsewhere, they talk about the situation of women. They talk about the nature of the nuclear family and how it also oppresses children, right? It makes children sort of abjectly subject to the whims of their parents, which can, be a bad thing if the parents are abusive, right? They thought they thought quite a lot about these things, and they wrote that you could tell the level of alienation in a society by looking at how women are treated in the society, because women, after all, are people. And so if women are being treated in a way that subordinates and dehumanizes them, that tells you something about how degraded the society is in terms of its ability to apprehend the significance of what it is to be in the presence of another human being. So I think both in Marx's work and in his work with Engels, and but also the Marxist tradition more broadly, one of the things that I say as often as anybody will hear me say it is that the idea that Marxism is white or that Marxism is male, it's difficult to maintain that belief unless you discount a lot of Marxists who have written and struggled and were not white and were not male. And probably in terms of sheer numbers, I haven't counted, but I would venture to guess that the absolute majority of people who have ever identified as Marxists and seen themselves as liberating, as being part of a Marxist liberation struggle, probably were not white, right? And so some of it is I think a kind of myopia, right, and a refusal, or at least, I don't know, incapacity or neglect, at least, to think globally about the impact of Marx's ideas and who has taken them up. And in my own work, I bring these things together. I have a few years before I published my book, I have an article called "What Could It Mean to Say Capitalism Causes Sexism and Racism?" And one of the things that I take up there is that Marx is not a class reductionist view. And the reason that class matters the way it does for Marx is that his emphasis is on production, on how it is that human beings are producing their circumstances. And it so happens that in a class society, that production is organized according to class, and that's why it matters. But that doesn't mean that we don't attend to all of the other things that human beings produce through class, and in ways that are shaped by class, which includes racism and sexism and all the rest, all the other transphobia and homophobia and so on.
Mhm. Great. So the book is again Marx's Ethical Vision. Of course, I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Wills, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Certainly. So I have a website. It's vanessawills.com. And sometimes I post on Twitter, or sorry, X. So my handle there is VCWILLS, VC Wills, and those are usually the best two places to learn about my work.
Great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a very fascinating conversation.
Thank you. These are great questions. It was really lovely to be in conversation with you. Thanks for having me on.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.